How's it going, everybody? I'm finally back from my Elden Ring hiatus, and I'm ready to talk to this camera for a few more hours. So recently I did a short little video about the war in Ukraine, and frankly, it was pretty bad. So I thought I would redeem myself by making a short little analysis about the Russian military, specifically why and how they're not exactly performing up to international standards, because if you've been following the news like me, you'll understand that they haven't been exactly painting the prettiest picture for any spectators. Regardless, this is not going to be perfect, so take what I say with a grain of salt and understand that this should be more of a basing off point for any research or just something that you use in casual conversation. But with all the fanfare and whatnot out of the way, let's just get right into the actual content itself. Beginning to really discuss where a lot of the root issues of the Russian Republic's military are, I feel like we have to start with the Republic's relationship with economic shock therapy. Economic shock therapy is the concept of rapidly transitioning a planned economy, for example, into a traditional market capitalist format. This undoubtedly had pretty harsh effects on Russia's population alone, not even mentioning its economy and military, which suffered from huge decreases in spending and investment and massive upticks in corruption. Some stories go as far to say that equipment as large as submarines were nearly sold off by officers just in the pursuit of cash alone. That's not even mentioning the organizational structure of the Russian military, which, given the collapse of the Soviet Union, had units simply leave and join new post Soviet states. Pretty much everything that could have gone wrong for the Russian military here did, and it set a pretty horrific precedent. Next, we'll be discussing two pretty important events that follow one another: the Russian military's 1992 formation and subsequent reformation, and the war in Chechnya. In 1992, as I had mentioned prior, the Russian Republic and its newly officially founded military were in shambles. Analytical papers from the Netherlands Institution for International Relations attest the fact the military simply couldn't provide for military families and their members. By 2002, it had gotten so horrific that up to 400,000 officers alone had left the army, and only 11% of conscripts actually participated within the military. Uh, this represents a pretty catastrophic degradation in Russia's quality, and that quality would soon be tested, not by any major military power, but by up to 40,000 Chechen secessionists with nothing but a dream and a hell of a lot of stolen guns. Chechnya. Oh Christ, where to begin? So, in 1991, Chechnya would declare its independence to the Russian Republic, capitalizing on the chaos and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And ultimately, up until 1994, the Russian military would not exactly do much aside from very minimal engagements and quite tense diplomatic pressure. All the while, however, the Chechen government would be preparing for the inevitable conflict with Russia. When the time for aggression actually came, the Russian Republic was noticeably confident in their performance, with the current defense minister at the time stating that Chechnya could be collapsed in a single day with a single paratroop brigade. I wonder how that one went. Absolutely, horrifically wrong. The Russian attempt to pacify Chechnya was an almost comical failure. Russian troops were poorly motivated, poorly equipped, and oftentimes didn't understand why they were fighting nor want to fight in the first place. They would quickly abandon their organization and cohesion and simply resort to desperately carpet bombing civilians, a move that expectedly only further bolstered the resistance they faced. It would finally end when they were forced out of Grozny, Chechnya's capital at the time, by a concerted and well-motivated force. They would attempt to regain initiative by trying to level the entire city, but that didn't work, unsurprisingly, and they were soon forced to leave in humiliation. What went wrong here? A lot did. The Russian military was incredibly demoralized, as much as Russian forces would nearly collapse after singular defeats. Furthermore, they underestimated their opponents to a ridiculous degree, and nothing to actually convince the Chechnyan population that Russia would be a better alternative. Finally, discipline and therefore high-quality training was lacking. So to add all these points together and really summarize it, I feel like we can put it into four key areas that they failed to achieve world success in. Overconfidence, poor morale, a lazy strategy that revolved around simply brute forcing the Chechens into submission, and a gross lack of discipline and high-quality troops. Like I said before, I'm really going over this with a whole lot of generalization. There are hours upon hours of information that could be covered here. I'm just trying to find the general trends that typically hamstring Russia's military and connect them to the modern conflict. Next, a brief intermission into the Russian military's 1990s reform program. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin's government was pretty much stuck with the old Soviet doctrine, a doctrine that focused more on non-aggression and military parity with the United States. Obviously, non-aggression wasn't a very important factor anymore, so the Russian doctrine was in pretty drastic need of an overhaul, and an effective one at that, too. In the interest of accuracy, however, I'm not stating that Russian military doctrine was incapable of fighting any sort of war, just that the focus of the post-Soviet general staff was not exactly in the correct area for a conflict like Chechnya. Digression aside, not too long around the beginning of the Chechnyan War, an ambitious reform program was undergone by Russia. The military was supposed to be downsized by around 600,000 individuals in an attempt to create a highly mobile and effective force for responding to external threats primarily. The question still remains, obviously, how well did Boris Yeltsin and his defense minister actually implement these reform programs? They didn't actually do any reforming at all, yeah. Boris Yeltsin failed to actually allow the Russian military to meaningfully reform itself, and infighting amongst generals actually opposed to downsizing practically crushed any meaningful progress that was being held. That didn't stop him and his defense ministers from lying repeatedly. It's just that it's kind of hard to lie when you're repeatedly being humiliated. Chechnya, in my opinion, was less of a wake-up call and more of an absolute national humiliation that necessitated reformation. It wasn't that Russia didn't know its military was decrepit, it was just too big to care, and to a degree, because I have to keep tying this into the introduction, it still is just too big to care at all. Later, another reform program in 1995 would be shot down, and the general responsible for it would be let go. Small attempts at reorganizing individual units and small branches of the Russian military would be made, but nothing meaningful would really be done, and especially nothing to meaningfully counter or prepare for the roughly a decade-old Chechen military. By 1996, the military and the country itself were pretty much reaching a point of critical collapse. Officers, not even speaking on conscripts, were forced to go up to 5 months without any sort of payment, not due to a lack of funds, but a deliberate plot by Russian military officials to increase funding for the Russian military. Sometimes fact is stranger than fiction, and this is definitely one of those cases because I had to do a few double takes reading this one. Unsurprisingly, Russia still really hadn't gotten over Chechnya, so in 1999, with a fresh Vladimir Putin at the helm, they would re-enter the country. Though this time they would be a tad bit more prepared. You see, Russia's general staff had laid out a few key points that they wanted to improve upon. Points that were actually pretty close to the ones that I thought of. Maybe I'll pick up a fun job at the Pentagon after this video. These points were communication and interdepartmental cohesiveness, unit reorganization, training, specifically in urban and mountainous terrain, and finally propaganda, because I think only around 10 people were actually interested in dying in Chechnya. With these reforms in mind, Russia would go on to operate a relatively successful campaign of total war against the Chechnyan people. Fueled by arms exports and oil prices, the Russian military had actually reached a relative standard of mediocre performance. Still, an estimated 15,000 soldiers alone would die, and the standard of living in Chechnya would be absolutely gutted, and as far as I'm concerned, still really hasn't recovered entirely. Hey, a brief intermission. I know I've been doing them a lot, but I kind of have to chill sometimes. Please consider liking and subscribing this. I know this isn't the best video you've probably watched in your life, but I'm definitely working at it. And I know just in a few, centuries, I will be at a pretty high standard of quality. So consider sticking around. Back to our regularly scheduled, fun, quirky, and wacky military analysis. Post-Chechnya, the Russian military would actually enjoy a pretty remarkable period of peace and relative stability. The only problem being the Chechen insurgency. This period of peace, however, would soon be thrown to pretty tense doubt with the election of a pro-Western Georgian president. This election would coincide with a remarkable increase in tension with pro-Russian separatists that would soon be supported by Russia themselves in a peacekeeping operation. The question obviously remains, how did they do? Better than Chechnya, but not really by much. The conflict would, as previously mentioned, kick off with a strong escalation of tension and activity by pro-Ossetian separatists. They would shell positions heavily, raise infrastructure, and attempt to destroy whole cities. The line of thinking here was that this escalation would force a Jordan response, which would then give the Russian government a free clause to intervene. The initial intervention actually went quite poorly for Russia. Aircraft losses and difficulties in even providing basic support were quite surprising, and it's an issue that I will be discussing later. However, the advance of the Russian military was pretty much inevitable. Russian forces were numerically superior and enjoyed the support of, quite bluntly, a bunch of genocidal bastards responsible for an ethnic cleansing in Georgia. Obviously, though, we have to discuss what specifically went wrong here and how they would later address it. Well, to really discuss where a lot of Russia's key failure points were in Georgia, we can boil it down to four pretty consistent failures. First, communication, primarily between literally every branch of the Russian military. In fact, it was so bad that an army commander alleges that he had to use a borrowed satellite phone to actually communicate with his men. Furthermore, pretty much the entire Air Force was outdated and incompetent, so much so that they were unable to attain air superiority from a country with literally no fighter aviation, and they managed to shoot down several of their own aircraft. Yeah. Finally, logistics and training. Several units were reportedly quite scarce in ammunition, which in a 12-day war is pretty humiliating, especially when you consider the fact that Georgia's, 1/100th Russia's size? Furthermore, and the most depressing part in my opinion, Russian officials admitted that professional troops were barely of a higher standard or caliber than conscripts. So, to really reiterate these points and get them into four concrete areas, their failures in the Georgian conflict were communication, Air Force cohesion, logistics, and training, which are quite close, but I feel like they're distinct enough that I can separate them. In order to be accurate, though, we have to discuss that Russia's performance was still improved to a degree. A Reuters analyst would go as far to claim as Russia's performance was strong but flawed, and that although they didn't perform admirably, and it was still a cause for concern, that they had still made progress. Obviously, Russia would not be entirely impressed by its performance and would undergo yet another series of reforms based around creating a modern and mobile military force. I promise we're close to Ukraine. We just got to get through Syria, and we're almost there. So the next batch of reforms would begin with an actually successful and at least mostly unopposed attempt at downsizing the Russian military, abandoning skeletal divisions in favor of a mobile force that was truly capable. What happened next is that they would fail at downsizing. By 2012, the Russian army composed of a force of around 800,000 men, which is a pretty stark decline. So much so that they actually forgot how to staff the military. They would reverse this and work towards steadily increasing the number of contracted troops, attempting to shift away from the conscript-dominated format of the Russian military. Finally, they would decide on a concrete goal. The Russian military wanted to work towards a ratio of 5 contract troopers for every 4 conscripts. In my opinion, that's still pretty bad, but who am I to complain? I have 0 failed military reformations under my belt, and Russia has so many that I've just stopped counting, and I've started crying over the ramshackle script I've written and how many pages it's become. I've done enough writing and talking to a pretty blank computer screen with nothing but my face to keep myself company to talk about the Russia-Ukraine war. It only took 7 pages and around a month of progress, but I'm so proud to have made it so far, and I'm really thankful that you did too. The war in Ukraine definitely began with a smash and a bang, so to speak, with most common people like you and I predicting a pretty swift overwhelming of the valiant Ukrainian forces and subsequent horrible atrocities. We were right about one part, at least. Russia has struggled considerably in their invasion. Operations have been poorly coordinated, air superiority hasn't been attained, and Ukraine's military is only going to get more and more sweet American healthcare funding. Ukrainian resolve is considerably stronger than expected, and they haven't even entirely secured their already spare supply lines, not even mentioning the pretty pitiful state of their electronic security. I'm not sure where to begin entirely on all of these failures, but I feel like a good start would be the overestimation of Russian capabilities by their leadership and the underestimation of Ukrainian capabilities. This is corroborated from a variety of admittedly Western sources, but it also just makes a good amount of sense. Why would you send a poorly trained, demoralized, and poorly equipped force against one that is motivated and bankrolled by America? That perfect, impeccable, and not at all shoddy transition helps me discuss the usage of conscripts in Ukraine. It was initially denied and then admitted that they were used in Ukraine, which presents an interesting succession of events. Either it was a Russian miscommunication, which, given the previous discussions on our Russian communication, seems admittedly quite likely, or another idea that applies a little bit too much malevolent intelligence to Russia. It's called Zerg rushing. It's discussed by armchair journals, obviously, that Russian troops of low quality are being used to test out the strength of Ukrainian defenses by kind of pointlessly dying in droves against fortified positions and every single type of explosive device known to man. I'm pretty skeptical because of the prior information on Russian overconfidence, but I cannot be entirely sure, and I kind of have to rely on intuition in less than 100% credible sources since the conflict is like a month old. Um, I'm not Joe Biden's defense minister. I can't get you the inside scoop. Russian logistics, like mentioned prior, have obviously been a pretty embarrassing mishap, but they aren't as entirely bad as presented. It's important to remember that truth is going to be the first casualty in war, and we're pretty exclusively going to hear about the admittedly large amount of humiliations that the Russian army is facing. Russian armored units have continually failed to maintain logical consistency, and it's reached the point where their vehicles are being towed away like Tonka trucks. Furthermore, there are only too many reports of Russian convoys being ambushed, which can only add to the stresses of the Russian logistical situation. Russia was clearly not adequately prepared for conflict of such a large country, which we've seen before, with Ukraine and Chechnya being pretty strong examples. Their fast attempt at blitzkrieging Ukraine simply failed and faltered when it met strong resistance, and their doctrine of blitzkrieg pretty quickly reverted back into their prior one of grinding, attritional, and exhausting warfare. It seems like they've reallocated their interest back into that doctrine, to be fair, with artillery usage increasing what feels like exponentially over the past few weeks of the invasion. They've definitely gotten slightly more competent at this, but given their prior record, the failures that they've been encountering are still ever so persistent in the face of any sort of dedicated military. Really, we can summarize the Russian performance in Ukraine with the same issues that we've seen before. Most importantly, because I feel like these are the really important ones for conducting a proper war: logistics, communication, and basic planning. I just don't know how they just cannot get off the ground with this. You'd think after several successive wars under your presidency, you'd learn how to fix a few of the problems. But they just haven't grabbed it yet, and thankfully, they're not grabbing it too fast in Ukraine. Sure, they're making ground in a few areas, but they've already been pushed back from Kiev in a few counterattacks, and they're still performing inadequately. Ukraine is only going to get stronger, and even if Ukraine does eventually fall, it will not be easy for Russia, and it's only getting harder by the day. We're kind of done. That was a lot for me. I could have definitely put in a few more hours of work, but I think I'm pretty satisfied with the increase in length and quality from my past video. This isn't perfect, obviously, but I do want to keep doing this, and I'd like to make more of a foray into domestic politics. But, who knows? Fate deals a cruel hand, and sometimes it doesn't, so I'm just going to keep working at it. Obviously, stick around with whatever fun shit I pump out, or at least, visit by and check out whatever I can, produce. With that, I do bid you adieu. You have a wonderful day. God bless.